Most of us are familiar with the story of the wise men and baby Jesus. That story is told just about every Christmas, and we know it pretty well. Baby Jesus is visited by a group of travelers from a faraway land who saw a star that signaled that there was a new king of the Jews, and so they travel a long distance to come and worship the newborn king. What we don't hear about is that this beloved Christmas story would have had a lot of significance to the original people that read it, and it wouldn't have anything to do with a Christmas celebration. Instead, it would bring them way back into the Old Testament and remind them of one of Israel's greatest heroes, the prophet Moses. Matthew, when he's setting up his gospel, he takes the first couple of chapters to pull in a few links to the Old Testament when he's telling the story of how Jesus came to be. And so this is one of the things that he's doing with the story of the Magi. He is going to subvert some of his readers' expectations in a way of pointing to how this story is going to play out over the rest of the gospel. And this is a really good example for us. Plus, if we understand what Matthew's doing here, then we'll have a little bit more appreciation for this story when we hear it during the Advent season. So, let's look at the similarities between baby Jesus and baby Moses in Matthew's first and second chapters. Let's jump in. Now, if you're familiar with the story of Moses, then you know that there was a time way toward the beginning of the Bible when Israel was enslaved in the nation of Egypt. The Pharaoh, that's the king of Egypt, said, Israel is growing too powerful, so let's oppress them, let's put them to work for us. And the people of Israel still continued to multiply, and so then Pharaoh says, I am going to kill all the baby boys. Every Hebrew baby boy should be thrown into the Nile. He wants to just kill them all off. But one baby escapes this fate, and that's baby Moses. You may have heard the story of how Moses' mother made a little boat for Moses and set him adrift in the Nile, and then Moses was discovered by one of the daughters of Pharaoh and raised in Pharaoh's house. Then Moses grew up to become a great prophet, and he saved Israel from slavery in Egypt. This is one of Israel's greatest heroes, and this is his origin story. And so what Matthew does when he is telling the story of how Jesus, whom Matthew believes to be the king of the Jews and a greater prophet than Moses, Matthew pulls in some comparisons to that origin story of Moses. Let's look at some of the similarities. We're going to see a lot of the same elements that are in the Old Testament account of baby Moses come into play with Jesus in this story of the wise men. So we have a threat, a king feels threatened by the promised child. So we have Pharaoh being afraid of Israel in Moses' case, and we're going to see something very similar in the story of Jesus. Then we have a plot where the king tries to do something about it to protect himself. We have a response from the people around the king where they need to choose whether they're going to comply with what the king wants and go along with the plot, or whether they're going to resist the king. We have an escape of the child, and then a return of the character later on. And with Moses, we see that playing out. So you can read about this in the first 2 chapters of Exodus. Pharaoh is afraid of Israel. He says, let's kill all the baby boys. But the Hebrew midwives, these are the women that are helping the Israelite mothers have their children, they resist. They don't kill the baby boys. Instead, they protect them. And they're called out as heroes in this story for doing this. And Moses' own mother hides him from the genocide, and Moses escapes the wrath of Pharaoh. He escapes from that incident in Egypt. Later on, Moses does need to go into exile for trying to save the people of Israel, but he returns to Egypt to save the people from slavery in Egypt. And that's the story that Matthew's readers would have been very, very familiar with. And so it's really interesting that in the second chapter of Matthew, we see some very similar things play out with the birth of Jesus. So, in Matthew chapter 2, we meet King Herod. King Herod is a puppet king of Rome. He's presiding over Jerusalem and Judea. That's one of the main areas in what was the land of Israel. And he is visited by these Magi, these sorcerers and wise men and astrologers from a faraway land, and they tell him, "We're here to meet the new king of the Jews. We saw his star and have come to worship him." And so Herod fears this. He feels threatened by some other king of the Jews. And later on, he hatches a plot to kill all the baby boys, very similar to Pharaoh. But what's very interesting in this story is that when Herod is afraid of the Messiah, when Herod feels threatened, we don't see the same response that we saw in Exodus. Instead, Herod pulls together all the teachers of the law, and the law came from Moses, so the people that followed Moses' teachings most closely. He pulls them together and says, "Where is this Messiah supposed to be born?" And what do? They give away the location. They say, "Oh, well, he's supposed to be born in Bethlehem." And so they tell Herod exactly where the child should be found, and Herod is able to go ahead with his plot to kill all the baby boys in Bethlehem. However, the Magi resist. These travelers from a distant land, they have no relationship with Israel's God. They aren't the people that Matthew's readers would expect to be the good guys here. They resist. They don't tell Herod where the child is, even though they find him and recognize him as king. And so we have this interesting scenario in that the king of the Jews is betrayed by the Jewish experts in the law, but protected by people that aren't Jewish. And then what happens is Herod's really mad. He's trying to kill off all the boys, and so Mary and Joseph and Jesus need to escape. Where do they escape to? They escape to Egypt. So whereas Moses escaped from Egypt, Jesus goes down to Egypt to escape the oppression of the rulers in Israel itself. So it's kind of backwards. Anyone familiar with the story of Moses would see some of these similarities and also some of these very, very strong differences. But later on, Jesus returns to Israel to save people from their sin. And this is something that an angel told Joseph at the beginning of this story in Matthew chapter 1. You're going to name the child Jesus because he will save the people from their sins. So we still have a similarity to Moses here. Moses returned to Egypt to save people from Egypt. Jesus is returning to Israel to save the people from sin. And this is something that we're going to see throughout the Gospel of Matthew. Whereas the Jewish people were expecting a Messiah to overthrow the other nations and lead the world in peace and justice, but in a way that vindicated Israel and saved Israel from them. Jesus' plans are a lot bigger. Jesus is working to undo sin everywhere, even inside Israel. And that's what we're going to see play out in the rest of Matthew. It's a pretty cool clue that's hidden right here at the beginning of Matthew that we don't always hear about when we're telling the Christmas story. But now you know. Now you can see how the story of the wise men or the Magi and baby Jesus points back to one of the greatest heroes of the Jewish religion and also points to an even greater hero, Jesus, the Messiah and the true King of the Jews. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope it was helpful. If you'd like to see more videos like this, go ahead and hit subscribe. That way we can notify you as soon as the next one goes live. I'm Jeffrey with Overview Bible. Thanks for watching.